Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. The political climate in Alberta. It's a fascinating beast these days. We're seeing things happen that probably we wouldn't have expected to see happen in the last 20, 30 years. You got to go all the way back to the Bible Belt days to really kind of get to the kind of controversy that we're seeing generated. And in order to do a little bit of a political gut check, there's a lot of people who are saying things have gotten really out of control, particularly in the last year, 2 years. But is that just hyperbole? We figured we'd go to somebody who's been playing in the Alberta political scene for more than a little while. And I'm still so happy that he said yes to come on the show. It is a genuine privilege to welcome to the show the Honorable, I'm using the honorific, Thomas Lukaszuk. Thomas, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So to get started, before we get into sort of the meatier topics of what I'm hoping that we can talk about today, if you could give just a brief, I mean, and it's hard to do brief when, 14 years in the legislature, but if you could give a brief bio and sort of explain to anybody who's not familiar with sort of your body of work, as it were, who is Thomas Lukaszuk?
Well, from a political perspective, I got first elected in 2001. And I wasn't planning to run for office, believe it or not. I was involved at the constituency association grassroots level, and all of a sudden, Premier Klein actually called me and suggested that I run for office. As a young guy at that point in time, Ralph Klein was bigger than life in Alberta. I was honored. And I thought about it. I just started a new business then. I was just fairly newly married then. It wasn't something that was ever in my plans. But I thought, if the premier asks you, you just do it. That's all there is to it. So I did, and I was lucky. I won the first election. And then the second election in 2004, it was the famous landslide Lukaszuk. There was a recount. I lost by 3 votes, then won by 5 votes in a recount. We lost all PC seats in Edmonton. Running as a PC in Edmonton was never easy. People will often say, well, you ran for PCs because you wanted to win. In Edmonton, you didn't run for PCs to win because usually all of Edmonton was either NDP or Liberal and NDP. In 2004, we lost all the seats other than Gene Zbozdeski and David Hancock, and then myself. And then a subsequent couple of elections and lost in 2015 when most of us lost. I was privileged to be in cabinet for a number of years, education, advanced education, labor, immigration, and then ultimately deputy premier portfolios. It's an honor. It's been an honor to serve. I'm glad I'm not there anymore. I think there's a reason why they call it the serving terms, because sometimes you think of it as an incarceration in a way when you look back. But it has been an honor, and now I can't say I enjoy, but I spend time watching what's going on in the province, and definitely being maybe more vocal than some would wish in social media on current events.
2015 was sort of a pivotal year in Alberta politics, I think it's safe to say, not only because it saw the end of a 44-year dynasty for the ruling Conservative Party, but it also saw some pretty major seismic shifts exist inside of the Conservative universe. So we saw the beginning of the end or the evolution for the PCs and the Wild Rose. What was your sense in 2015 of where things were going to go? Would you have predicted that they've gone to, or would you have anticipated that they've gone to where we are today?
No, that election in 2015 was very interesting. As you know, I ran for leadership just prior to that against Jim Prentice. So I thought I had a pretty good finger on the pulse because I traveled the province for 3 months straight. There wasn't a town or village or city that I didn't visit. And I already then knew that there are issues, without a doubt. And the issues were, people were getting tired of PC, but there was a definite sense of entitlement within the PC party, and not only among elected members. I would even argue less so among the elected members, but within the machinery of the party, the kingmakers. the lobbyists and the consultants and the money behind the party. They simply expected to win elections, and for them it was a business proposition, because that's how they were making money, and it was becoming more and more visible. And then Prentice becomes a premier, and even though it was a very interesting leadership race, that one didn't get investigated by RCMP. Perhaps it could have as well. There was some funny stuff, but not to say that he didn't win. He would have won, I think, no matter what. He was well received by the party, but not well received by Albertans. Even though he was an Alberta MP from Calgary for a number of years prior, he just didn't have that magic touch, and he didn't resonate with Albertans very well. His comment, "Look in the mirror," was probably something that solidified Albertans' feelings about Prentice. So as I was door knocking in that 2015 campaign, I knew that this is not just another Castle Downs campaign, because I door knocked those doors over and over for years, and I was getting a different reception. And it was often, "Thomas, we like you, you've done a good job, but I can't vote for you this time around because," and they would have a reason why they couldn't. It was the beginning of the end. We knew it was going to come. But you know what was the most interesting thing? I'll never forget that we would have telephone calls with Premier Prentice, and all these candidates and MLAs would be reporting to him during the campaign, how are things in their own ridings. And everybody was telling Prentice, "Oh, things are great. People love us. We're going to win." And I thought to myself, unless my riding is so unique, I don't think we're going to win. And I remember actually saying that on the phone call, and everybody was incensed that, how dare you say that we're not winning? There was this hesitation within the PC party to even admit the possibility of losing an election. And I think a lot of people were really shocked that evening. And then Prentice, as you remember, just walked off the stage and was never to be seen again as a leader of the party.
Where did you land after 2015?
I went into private sector. I was a teacher for a while, but I worked for over 7 years for myself. I had a company that represented injured workers with their contentious WCB claims for a number of years. So after that, I went into private sector. I started a construction company that I'm no longer involved with. I passed it on, and now in finance, my company provides financing to Canadian Muslims who cannot deal with conventional banks for religious reasons. So we provide what's known as halal financing, mortgages. Haven't been involved politically at all, other than through commentaries. And believe it or not, last, I believe it was Sunday, for a first time since 2015, I door knocked.
We're gonna get to that in a bit. I don't want to. I think everybody knows, anyways. But I want to get to how you did the door knocking. But I still want to sort of walk through a little bit more history. 2015 to 2017 saw some major changes for the conservative movement in Alberta. We saw the return, I'm not sure what the right word is to use, of Mr. Kenney, and he brought with him his plan to unite the right. What were your impressions when Mr. Kenney announced that he was going to run for the leadership of both parties and smush them both together?
Well, I quite publicly ripped up my PC membership there. And I believe I tweeted it out. It ended up in a trash can on a street of Calgary. To me, it was unacceptable for a number of reasons. Number one, in my mind, Mr. Kenney could never be a leader of a PC party. He was never a PC supporter. As a matter of fact, as a member of parliament, he worked overtime to make sure that our PC government would lose in Alberta. He was a Wild Rose supporter or any other French right-wing party supporter, working very hard against us. Very critical of Ralph Klein and any subsequent premier. So he was definitely not an ally of the party. Second of all, his views were where even though we had cabinet ministers who would share his views, but they were sort of on the right fringe within our cabinet, but they were not reflective of the rank and file party members. Plus, as you know, I had a unique way of knowing Kenney, and everybody remembers the fact that he called me an a-hole. and that will probably go into history. But the fact is that there was a reason why this issue arose, and it was he was a minister of immigration at the same time when I was a minister of immigration, there was one particular file where we had a woman who was working as a temporary foreign worker at McDonald's, got hit by a car when she was riding a bicycle to work and became quadriplegic, and he insisted on deporting her to Philippines, where all medical doctors in Canada were saying if you send her there, she will definitely die because she may not even survive the flight. Never mind, there is no adequate medical care to treat this woman. And his answer was, what don't you understand about temporary and worker? She's not a worker, so she has to leave. A few lawyers in Edmonton and we launched a lawyer's work pro bono, a challenge to the federal court, and we won. And she is in Edmonton, and believe it or not, she's recovered and employed. And that gave me a sort of an insight into Jason Kenney, who he really is as an individual. So I worked overtime to try to oppose, that momentum that he had behind him to unite the party. But he succeeded, and this also showed me another issue within the Conservative Party, is that the only thing that united the PC party really was winning. This was a coalition to win, because when you looked at our caucus very often, you had guys like David Hancock, myself, Doug Griffiths, Ed Stelmach, who would be centrists, sometimes even center-left, with guys like Ted Morton, Lloyd Snellgrove, and Marianne Jablonski, who are ultra right-wingers, both from a social and any other perspective. But what kept that caucus together was that this was a formula for winning, and it worked for 44 years, and we always found some kind of a compromise. Well, once those parties split into Wild Rose and PC, there was no way to put this Humpty Dumpty back together again. And Kenney did it, but he really didn't. He thought he did, but look where we are right now. He thought this would be a formula for winning, but what he didn't realize is that, when you sleep with dogs, you get fleas, and he welcomed everybody into this tent, and now those fleas are biting them.
I'm curious. I mean, one of the conversations, and you kind of hit on the nail on the head right there, one of the conversations that more and more people seem to be having is, what does it even mean to be conservative in the province of Alberta? Because there have been historically all of the 41 different flavors of conservatism that exist. Why do you think it was that it was it just the winning? Why do you think they were able to at least publicly peacefully coexist for the most part, and now we're seeing a whole different thing?
We were lucky in the PC caucus because we wanted to win. We were motivated to compromise. So we had some ugly caucus meetings where we would really battle it out, and believe it or not, grown men would cry over issues. But then the agreement was, at the end, you don't always get it your way. Here is a compromise, and this will be our policy. And that policy satisfied most of the time enough to win the next election. It was never perhaps ideal, but it was a satisfactory compromise. And that was the magic sauce that we had within the PC caucus. Now this compromise doesn't exist. The UCP caucus doesn't have Dave Hancocks and Stelmachs and myself and Griffiths in it. So there is no compromising. Those whom I would be arguing against in caucus are now the government, without any tempering of their policies. So that is the difference between that particular PC party and what you have right now in UCP.
One of the other things that I wanted to sort of historically get your take on is, I mean, I have been paying attention to politics for a little while now, but it wasn't really until 2015, 2016 that I started to really closely pay attention. And one of the things that seemed to strike me about when Mr. Kenney took office as premier was, and there's no question that he had some political goals that I find disagreeable, I'll say, in order to be polite. The Bill 8 is an excellent example of that's super gross. But you can sort of set aside, I think, to some degree, there was the political side that was gross, but there was also this other side. And this other side seemed to be almost an open contempt within his caucus for not just the processes of governing, but the building itself. Like I remember in 2019 when the poster went up in the windows of the legislature, and I think most people who pay attention to politics went, "Wow, that's offside." And I guess the question that I have is, was that unprecedented? Did you see earplugs being handed out in the legislature during your time there? Did you see people engaging in that sort of theatrics and lack of decorum?
No, there always was a component of lack of decorum. When you're dealing with people, you will always find few individuals, but it wasn't systematic. It wasn't institutionalized. Like it started with Kenny, and we still see it now. There was certain reverence with respect to the legislature building. People were honored to be in that building. It was sort of the cathedral to democracy. That appears to be gone, but it has to do with populism. See, part of populism is undermining democratic institutions, and trying to discredit democratic institutions, courts, policing, CBC, anything that stands for what they would call establishment. And when you weaken democratic institutions, it's easier to bring anarchy into play, and it's easier to play up the discontent of the masses. It's not a new formula. French Revolution was based on that. Hitler's rising to power in 1932 was based on that. Trump was based on that. Brexit was based on that. But ultimately, it becomes a scenario of a dog chasing a car. Dog will chase a car and bark at it, but once it finally catches up to the car, the dog doesn't know what to do with that car, right? They have the same problem. They bark, they make a lot of noise, they try to get people angry, and when it works and they win power, they have no idea what to do with it. They fumble. Kenny fumbled, Trump fumbled, and look what Danielle Smith is doing right now. Because they're attracting the wrong people. They're attracting what I call team angry into their caucus, but those are not people who A, have any respect for the office that they have just won, and B, they honestly don't understand what is the role of that office and how to handle the authority that has been granted to them by voters, by Albertans. So you end up with the bizarre situations that you have right now. We are in the midst of a populist wave, and the wave works in such a way. Aspiring politician like the leader of the Federal Conservative Party says to you, "You're a good guy. You work really hard. Nobody ever listened to you. Teachers always scolded you. Your boss is never happy with you, but you're a good guy." And that shouldn't be happening. Actually, all those teachers and everybody with any credentials are wrong. You're the guy who actually was right all the time. Well, this guy says, well, finally, somebody's listening to me. Somebody finally understands me. And then the leader says, and you should be even more angry. And your enemies, and there's always an external enemy. For Trump, it was Mexicans. For Brexit, it was Poles and Ukrainians and others supposedly still stealing their jobs. For Hitler, it was Jews. For Danielle Smith and Kenny, it's Ottawa or liberals. It doesn't frankly matter who's in Ottawa, as long as it's Ottawa. There has to be an external enemy, and then you argue, and I am the only guy who will defend you against those external forces. It's sort of like a castle under siege, and I am your savior, and it's a formula that allows for wins. The problem is that once they win, as I said earlier, that group of people cannot execute with any dignity or even effectiveness the roles that they have been assigned.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I keep going back to with the populism piece and the, oh, shucks, I'm just like you, we see with Smith and her health spending accounts. She goes on over and over and over again about how, well, the politicians, they get a health spending account, so why don't you? And it follows that formula almost perfectly, but every time she says it, there's a part of me that goes, how are there not more people saying, you're one of them, though? Like, you get that you're a politician, Danielle. Like, and there's certainly UCP MLAs who quite candidly will say there's a certain one whose name might rhyme with Payne Metzen who openly says, I'm not a politician. Yeah, you are, dude. But they're very, very good at disabusing the public of the notion that they are part of the machine that they're simultaneously saying people should get angry at.
And oddly enough, people are buying it, and they speak to government in second person, as if they are not government. And frankly, you could be in government tomorrow. I could be in government tomorrow. Run for office, and you can be in government. Government is not some external power that is imposed on you. You go out and vote, and you will decide who the government will be. But they refer to public institutions as the forces of oppression, and you need to fight against that oppression. And even though they are actually, like you mentioned quite astutely, they are part of the machine, but they try to portray themselves as sort of insiders who can defend you against the machine. They need a struggle. They always need their potential supporter to feel that he or she is somehow oppressed by the machine, and they will save you from it. It's bizarre. It's illogical, but it's easy to explain. Mr. Poilievre over the last few days is really harping at CBC that it's government-owned broadcaster. Well, it always was. It didn't bother anybody when Harper was the prime minister and CBC was government-funded. That's how public broadcasters operate in most democracies. Their content is not controlled by either Harper nor Trudeau right now. But it doesn't matter because it just gets people riled up, and that's all they really want. And notice that there never is a solution. They will tell you that you should be angry at something, but they will never tell you how they will solve it. Because it is rising to power. It's easier to get people aroused with negativity than it is to get people to follow you on policy and ideas and plans and aspirations. You need more time to explain those concepts. To get people peed off, it's easy to tap into that, and people are likely to say, yeah. So they always claim that there are elites, and elites is anybody who has any education or any expertise in anything. And it's odd because when they get sick, they actually go and see doctors. I imagine when their car breaks down, they go and see a mechanic.
I don't know if Danielle Smith actually does go to see a doctor.
Well, some of them maybe don't. But the fact is that we all have certain expertise, either from education or experience, and then we turn to those experts. When my car breaks down, I go to a car mechanic. And it goes with any type of expertise. But this movement is against expertise because those are elites, because those are the people who are always telling you what to do. Your teacher was telling you what to do by the virtue of the fact that he or she were a teacher. And they're starting to sort of tap into this pent-up resentment of authority. Why should you be telling me what to do? And it's sort of a form of libertarianism. But the problem is, the odd part, libertarians who are against government are running for government to form a government to argue that there shouldn't be a government. It's as bizarre as it gets. But unfortunately, this formula has proven itself to be quite effective.
Yeah, it blows my mind. I mean, you talked about people buying it despite all evidence to the contrary. And I remember when I saw Kenny first quite literally roll onto the scene with his pickup truck And my first immediate reaction was like, oh, it's a new truck that is right there. Like this guy doesn't drive this truck, and he demonstrated down the road that he had some difficulties fueling it. But people still, I had conversations with people in 2019 who were saying, he drives a Dodge, he's just like me. And it's like, you buy that.
I know, and see Kenny, interesting, because I met Kenny in Ottawa a number of times. There's a different Kenny in Ottawa. Kenny in Ottawa not only dresses differently, he wears suits like everybody else in Ottawa, but if you ever listen to Kenny speak in Ottawa, he actually uses a different language, more business-like language. He's not trying to sort of, fewer platitudes, and he over here, he's a good country kind of a guy, always from Alberta. He's not from Alberta, and there were two Kennys. And good on him. He was able to reposition himself, reinvent himself, and shame on us that we as Albertans are buying it. But we're not very discriminating when it comes to voting. You look who became the leader of the UCP party right now. I cannot imagine a few years ago to have someone run for office who knows so little about the office that she's running for, that she honestly thinks that she can dispense immunities and that her powers are the same as of a governor in the United States. Learning the very basics on the job that actually grade 6 curriculum covers in the province of Alberta. And the fact that she was actually a leader of an opposition. She was in the legislature for a while, so she had an opportunity to at least learn from watching. Obviously, none of that sunk in, and yet it didn't seem to matter. Frankly, I think some of her supporters like the fact that she knows little. The less she knows, and the less she appears to be part of the machine. So ignorance is actually a good thing.
I wanted to. I mean, there's two. You gave me two things that I want to kind of branch off there. The first one is, you talked about Kenny's ability to play to different audiences, I'll say. And Danielle Smiths certainly seems to have that same ability. Where do you think the line is between being able to, I'll say, speak the language of your constituents and manipulating the constituents that you're speaking the language of to make them believe that you're something that you're not?
Yeah, you know what? And that's a very important distinction. I think in politics, like in any public communicating role that you would have in any other profession, it is important to be able to read your audience and tap into them to send the same message. So if you're speaking to a grade 6 class and you're speaking to a postgraduate university class, even though you're conveying the same subject matter, you will speak to them differently. You will use different vocabulary, use different anecdotes or examples. But you are always sending the same message. You're just adjusting the language and the level, the technicality to age or whatever it may be specific. With Kenny, and that's genuine, and that is the right thing to do to be effective. With Kenny, unfortunately, he was selling himself as a totally different person. Frankly, I don't know if there is anyone who knows the real Jason Kenney. He's a very complicated man who spent his entire life in an elected office. From childhood was involved 100% of his time in politics. That's very unique, and I don't think it's a good thing. I think we need politicians that reflect all of us. We need politicians that have real life experience. We need politicians that wake up in the middle of the night because they have a crying baby, and they have a sick mom, and they have family issues, and they worked in different industries, in different careers prior. Then you bring that wealth of your personal lived experience to the legislature, and you can better relate with constituents, and you can draft better laws. Unfortunately, and this is very unique, and I'll touch upon that word, to the conservative movement. They tend to have in their folds a lot of predominantly young men, although there are some women, but predominantly young men who, instead of chasing dates in high school and trying out for a soccer or football team and getting themselves in a little bit of mischief, like all of us did, they become these political hacks and they work in ministers and MLAs and MPs offices at the age of 16, which to me is always, I thought of a little unnatural. And then they grow into volunteers and they run for office. You know, in St. Albert, Michael Cooper is a prime example of one. Jason Kenney was one. Stephen Harper was one. Polyev was one. You know, there's a whole list of them that sort of lived that political life almost exclusively and lack in a lot of social skills and other transferable skills that would actually serve them well in politics later.
It's fascinating to me that you talk about the lack of social skills. I'm not going to say which one, but one of them might have definitely blocked the show after their Christmas message, which appeared to be delivered by an animatronic version of themselves. It's fascinating to me how somebody can exist in that political environment where...
Well, I'll tell you who it is, because he threatens me with lawsuits all the time. That's my MP, Michael Cooper. You know, there is an interesting character. St. Albert has a NDP MLA, but yet elects Michael Cooper to the federal government. And here is a guy who has unprecedented achievement, let's call it, to have, for a first time in the history of the House of Commons, his speech removed from the official record of the House of Commons from the Hansard, because he was actually reading out the Mass Murderers from New Zealand manifesto. So all the other members of parliament decided we can't have this in Canada's official record, and they removed that. Now, here's a guy who refers to Muslims as the goat herding culture, and his list goes on and on and on, but he keeps getting reelected in St. Albert in a riding that provincially elects NDP MLAs. So there's this disconnection. You know, there is a lot of people will simply vote federally for conservative, no matter who runs. And unfortunately, and I don't know, maybe as an educator and former minister of education, maybe I failed. We somehow don't get our young people to learn and absorb the importance of researching your candidates and becoming very discriminate voters. You know, if guys like Michael Cooper can get elected, you know, frankly, honestly, anybody can get elected. You know, if you can have a person become a premier of our province who today on Holocaust Memorial Day appoints an anti-Semite, and not that she didn't know because they disqualified him from running for the UPC because he's an anti-Semite, she appoints him on Holocaust Memorial Day to what? To the Multiculturalism Advisory Council. You know, that is so crazy that you can't even believe that it is true. But when people who get elected simply because they run against the very idea of government get elected, that's what they do.
I was stunned with Mr. Khan did quit today, but I was stunned, quite frankly, that Danielle Smiths, anyone in a leadership position would let that person quit. I mean, especially given that today we're recording this on April 17th, especially given that today is Holocaust Memorial Day, that to me would be a day where you would want to make it absolutely clear, nuh-uh, I won't tolerate this stuff. Even if it was just a performance, because very clearly they did know what Mr. Khan's history was, because they're the ones who investigated it. I found it particularly bold of them to try to claim that they didn't know when the person who was standing next to Danielle Smith during that whole presentation, one of them was Rajan Sani, and she's the person that was nominated in the constituency that he was disqualified from. So there's no way, there's just no way. But there seems to be this culture of
they don't care. They just don't care. They just don't care. That's the thing. They feel they're invincible. They think they have their numbers, and they don't care. And they know that their core support has no issue with that. Trump said that. He said I can shoot somebody right in the middle of, I think it was Broadway Avenue in New York, and I will get reelected the next day. It is that attitude. We're invincible. Our masses love us, and we can do whatever we want with impunity. This whole issue with Danielle Smith and Crown prosecutors, that few years ago would have been enough for a premier to resign, because the party would make that premier resign as a leader of the party. There is no way. I know that people don't have fond memories of Alison Redford, and I was one of the ones in caucus who asked her to resign. But it was caucus that wanted her to resign. She was pushed out internally, and frankly, her errors and sins pale in comparison to what Danielle Smith will do in just one day. But the scope of what was unacceptable then, and what party would push out a leader, don't apply anymore. There's just no way that with her track record of what she has pulled off, because there's no better way of calling it, from the day she walked into the premier's office till today, that she would be a leader of any credible political party, particularly governing party, in this country just a decade ago.
We're gonna focus in on Smith now. So you sat in the legislature at the same time that Danielle Smith sat in the legislature. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Correct.
I mean, you kind of talked about it earlier. One of the things that I know that I've been saying, and that I know there's no shortage of other pundits and commentators who have been saying, is how in the hell did she serve in government for as long as she did and not pick up any of this stuff? And when you watch some of the video of her in the legislature, it seems like it's almost an entirely different person, because she is making arguments that at the very least seem marginally cogent. But you compare that to, like, how does she know so little? Is that what you saw in the legislature in your time with her? Was she just performing, or was it?
So it's easy because she's a news anchor. That's what she is. And I have to be careful what I say, because I happen to be married to one. But reading a teleprompter is very different than making those decisions about which you're reading off the teleprompter. So Danielle Smith would show up in question period with 3 questions pre-written, and she would have rehearsed them, because you can tell, I've been around long enough just watching how she stands up and how she, the intonation of her voice and how she asked the question. But she would ask 3 questions, and it didn't matter what I answered as an answer. Her second and third questions would be exactly the same. And that's all she really had to do, read questions. When we noticed that the moment she was put in a position where she has to start thinking and making decisions on the go, and analyzing information, she fails. And that was hosting of the radio show in Calgary. The moment you gave her a microphone and no script, where she had to interact with callers and express her own opinions, the show had to can her, because she was getting herself into a lot of trouble, and getting the radio station into a lot of trouble. So couldn't do it. Now, as a premier, you answer questions. You don't know what those questions will be. Media throws questions at you, and you have to have at least fundamental understanding of government and your portfolio, and as a premier or deputy premier, all portfolios, that you can answer any question that's thrown at you. And even if you don't know the answer, you know enough to figure out what the answer likely would be. She's lacking that skill, because she doesn't have the fundamental understanding of what the answer would be. It's like getting an actor off a script of General Hospital and putting him into a surgical room and say, you play the doctor, now be the doctor. Well, 2 different things. She played the doctor. She doesn't know how to be one. She pretended to be a premier. She doesn't know how to be one, because, sometimes I honestly feel bad for her, because it just can't be easy when people are throwing questions at you and you don't even have a fundamental understanding of what you're talking about. I was lucky. Ralph Klein had a system. When you first got appointed as an MLA, he watched his MLAs, and if he thought you had potential to be in cabinet one day, he would assign you to a senior cabinet minister. So one day he tapped me on the shoulder and said, "You will be following Clint Dunford." And that was my minister. And I lived his life. I was following him for a long, long time. And you learn and you absorb. Then he would give you chairmanship of a committee. Then he will give you a parliamentary assistant position. By the time you got to cabinet, you knew how the system works. And even if you didn't know, you had an intuitive understanding of what the right or wrong answer would be, or when to shut up and not say anything. She doesn't have that. You give her a microphone, you ask her a question, she'll give you an answer. It could be the stupidest answer in the world, but she'll give you an answer. And it became most evident with this Crown prosecutor thing. First she comes out and she reads off a note from a lawyer. Her advice wasn't correct, but fine, she stuck with it. But a day later, she goes on a radio show and she starts talking about it. And then she comes out again and says, "No, I can't talk about it." And you start wondering, does this woman know what she's doing? The problem is that the office of a premier is a very powerful office in this country. Premiers can make unilateral decisions. Premiers can jeopardize our relationships, not only within the province, but within the country, and particularly internationally. I'm wondering, UCP likes to drive this message that they're good for business and investment. What do you think investors who are watching us like hawks, large companies, they watch every province like hawks, what are they thinking about this political climate? If you are a large American or European or Asian company and you are contemplating investing in this province, would you invest in a province where you have no clue what the premier will do tomorrow? Where there's even no pattern. Some premiers, they could be somewhat radical, but at least they follow some script, some narrative. You can sort of predict what they will do next. With her, it's hard to predict. You give her a microphone and she can put you out of business tomorrow.
Even just the recent press conference that she did where she was asked as she was, and again, it baffles me who's doing the messaging, who's crafting the messaging, because Danielle Smiths says, "You know what, I'm going to make a commitment to public health care. I'm going to do it in front of a fee-for-service healthcare facility. And then when I'm asked about the ethics commissioner, I'm going to refer journalists to the ethics commissioner's office." Even if you go to the front page of the ethics commissioner's website, it very clearly says no questions, and that she can't answer them. It was just, I honestly can't wrap my head around how nobody's, because she's so good with the script, and she really is. I've been saying for months now, the biggest difference between Danielle Smith and Rachel Notley from a communications perspective is when Rachel Notley's on script, she sounds like she's talking to kindergarten students. When she's off script, she's something else. And Danielle Smith is the exact inverse. When she's on script, she's incredibly well-spoken.
She reads news well.
Yeah, but as soon as you ask her for an independent thought, she'll just be like, "I guess I'm making shit up."
Well, because she doesn't understand it. She often doesn't understand what she just read. And I honestly do feel bad saying that, because she's a person, and she has dignity as a human being, and I hate to belittle her, but the fact is that I would not do well in a car mechanic shop. Not what I'm good at. I would not do well in a hospital. Not what I'm good at. And I know what I don't know, and I will not put myself in that place and embarrass myself. Unfortunately, she either has been put into that position by insincere friends who advised her to do it, or simply her ego was bigger than it should have been, and she put herself in a position where she doesn't even understand what she reads, because often she will extrapolate on something she read, and her handlers must be thinking, "Shut up, don't say a word, just read what we wrote you and you'll be just fine." They will be well served to send her on a holiday now for the next 2 months, keep her out of the province, and I think their chances would improve dramatically. But that's what happens. It's dangerous. We had a little bit of that problem with Ralph Klein sometimes. I always like to juxtapose Ralph Klein and Ed Stelmach. When Stelmach was my premier, it was scary because he knew all of our portfolios to detail. And in caucus as a minister, I could never BS him because he sort of knew what goes on in my portfolio. With Ralph Klein was an early version, less dangerous or not dangerous version of a populist. He was selling the message well. People sort of liked him, but he had no clue about policy. I remember as a newly elected MLA in 2001, we were sitting in one of my first caucus meetings, and some minister was explaining something, and Ralph was asking questions. And I thought to myself, okay, he's playing a game. He's asking those questions to see if the minister knows the answer, but he's a premier. He must know the answer. He sure as hell did not know the answer. Ralph Klein was not a policy guy. So for us as elected members with Ralph Klein, we always hoped that he would not go on a tangent with the media. Just stick to your script and stay there. Now, Danielle is 100 times worse because Ralph knew what he didn't know. And Ralph relied on his ministers and advisors. She doesn't. She just sort of makes up policy on the fly.
I think we saw that with her whole, we'll just deputize ambassadors of vacationing Albertans to get around the American travel restrictions. That was, I mean, it's just, there's so, it's just very fertile ground, I'll say. That kind of brings us up to where we are now, I think, a little bit. And, you know, this past weekend, you definitely raised some eyebrows because you definitely have been you haven't held your criticism when it comes to the UCP. You haven't held your criticism when it comes to Danielle Smith, but I think that you, in many ways, embodied the shifts that we've seen within the political spectrum. The UCP have moved farther and farther and farther to the right. I would argue past the Wild Rose at this point. And with that, the NDP have moved a little bit more to the right, more century lefty, but they're definitely more right than they used to be. And that seems to be appealing to some folks, yourself included. What made the decision for you? What sealed the deal to get off the bench?
Well, a few things, just to before I answer that question, even Danielle Smith, she probably regrets saying it, like she regrets saying everything she said yesterday. But one of the things she said is that Premier Lougheed and Rachel Notley govern the same way. They're exactly the same. And she was referring to him as a socialist. So they are so far to the right that guys like Lougheed, they refer to them as socialists. What made the difference? NDP is not my flavor either. I have epic battles with Rachel Notley and Brian Mason in the legislature because we disagreed on approaches and policies and matters of that nature. But I can tell you one thing, both with Rachel and with Brian and several other NDP MLAs that were there, a couple are still elected, there was mutual respect. They knew their stuff. Rachel knows policy. She knows governance. She knows law. She knows intergovernmental relations like nobody's business. So when we argued, it was a well-versed argument. It was based on facts, and nobody could BS the other one because you knew that they would call you on it if you tried. So that was important. It was facts, knowledge, research-based, arguments and development of policy. Second thing was there was trust. Often, as a deputy premier, I would sit down with Rachel or with Brian Mason and say, "Look, let's hammer this out. We can end this session early. What is it that you're looking for?" You would make deals on off-the-record basis, and trust was never breached. When you made a deal, and they honored that deal. So that was important. And in the second, during the committee stage of a passing of a bill in the House, MLAs get to sit anywhere they want in the chamber. They don't have to sit in their own seat. I would always make a point to go across and sit down with some opposition member just to ask them how are things in their writing. And when you discuss things with Rachel, I was always satisfied that she's doing what she's doing with noble intentions for her constituents and for the province. We may differ on how we want to get there, but I never ever questioned her motivations. It wasn't because some lobbyist is lobbying her or some friend of a friend or family member. She always had good policy reason for why she was asking for what she was asking. I could never say that about Danielle Smith. As I said earlier, and I had the unfortunate position, Redford was, and I'm being this will be the understatement of the year, was not fond of Danielle Smith. So when Danielle Smith was in question period, Redford would absent herself, which meant that I had to field all the questions. She just refused to answer Danielle Smith's questions. So, like I said earlier, Danielle Smith would read a question which was definitely written for her, but you knew that she didn't know the substance. And when you tried to answer the question, often a good MLA like Rachel or Brian Mason or many others, they would adjust their second question to accommodate your answer and sort of build on that answer and maybe try to nail you even harder. She wouldn't. She would just read the next question, which so often she would read three questions, which I already answered in the first answer, and she would still read the same questions because she had nothing else. That's what they wrote her. That's what she read. But during debate, when it is a little bit free scripted, that's when you really get the real side of an MLA. When you have a leader of the opposition who's in the House reading speeches from a piece of paper and never puts the paper down and just sort of goes on a tangent and talks about her own experience or her constituents, and that this is a scripted leader of the opposition. But the biggest part is trust. And when she crossed the floor, two PCs, and she will still deny it, but she can't deny it because there are those of individuals like myself who are still alive to know that she made a deal with Prentice for cabinet. She made a deal for herself and for Rob Anderson and a couple others to get cabinet positions. Unfortunately for our PC caucus, there was a rebellion inside of our PC caucus. We said, not a chance in hell. Prentice said, well, too late. I already asked them to cross the floor. Danielle actually is upstairs in the government house waiting to walk down the stairs with me to a media announcement, but he pulled the cabinet appointments. So Danielle sold out her own party for her own political gain to get into cabinet. And to me, that's a no-no. First of all, to me, floor crossing is a no. Frankly, it should be illegal. But second of all, if you're floor crossing because you cooked up a deal for yourself to sit in the cabinet, I find that despicable. That's a betrayal of the process. It's a betrayal of your constituents. It's a betrayal of your colleagues in caucus, because not all floor crosses were going to get cabinet positions. Only herself and a couple others. So that was a terrible betrayal in my mind. So I can't trust her, and I never will trust her. And I know for a fact that she simply does not have the capacity to serve as a premier. So why did I make the decision? Boy, that was a long answer. I'm lending my vote to NDP. I'm not giving it to them. They won't have it forever. They may not have it in the subsequent election. But I'm looking at what is good for this province, what is good for my girls, my daughters, what is good for you and me in this province. And even though I don't always agree with everything Rachel does, and even though I think she made some mistakes when she was a premier, I think her mistakes are not as detrimental ever as the damage that Danielle Smith is doing and will do to our province if she becomes the premier. Some of the errors that, and yes, Rachel made mistakes at the very beginning. She had a caucus of newbies. No one has ever been elected before, and she had to build a cabinet out of that. And she found out she's going to be a premier about 2 weeks prior to becoming a premier. And oil prices dropped. So yeah, she made some mistakes up front. But I can tell you the last 2 years of her premiership, many of my colleagues and I from the PC caucus discussed, we said we would probably make the same decision. We would probably govern the same way. She became a very well-versed center lane premier making decisions that were sort of evidence based. So if anybody is concerned about Rachel causing damage, I'll tell you, first of all, the magnitude of damage compared to Danielle Smith is simply not comparable. But the kind of mistakes that Rachel makes are easily fixed. You adjust the policy, reverse the policy. Unfortunately, Danielle is causing damage to our democratic institutions, which in some cases may be irreparable. Once people lose faith and confidence in justice, once people lose confidence in the legislature and how laws are passed in this country, once people lose confidence in law enforcement, there may be no turning back. And we can't afford to put ourselves in that position. So to me, this is existential. This election really is existential. And I feel that for the good of the province, I am with very easy conscience saying I am endorsing NDP and Rachel. And then we'll see what happens after, come next election. Maybe some centrist party will evolve. Frankly, NDP has moved pretty close to what the new center is. I don't know, but sometimes in my position, you have to hold your nose a little. But I can do this, and I know I'm doing the right thing. So I'm encouraging all other, PC supporters, take a look. Is this where you see yourself? Does this remind you of Lougheed, of Getty, of Ralph Klein, of Stelmach, of Redford, of Prentice, of Hancock? No. This is not even remotely similar to what PC Party used to be. So how can you possibly vote for it? I say to you, either spoil your ballot if that's the best that you can do, or give Rachel a shot and simply lend your vote to her. Don't give it to her, lend it to her. But for our province, that's the right thing to do right now.
And I think it's an interesting point that you raised there. I like the language of lending there. That's very well crafted, because I think that there's a lot of people who have a fear of, well, if we go for this other party. I mean, Alberta is, it's well known. I have a history with the Alberta Party. And, in a perfect world, I'd love to see multiple parties represented in the legislature, but that's just not where we are right now. There's even lending a vote, or as you said, spoiling a ballot, doesn't mean that you can no longer hold the next government to account, because at least we know that by the established rules and the accepted norms, the NDP will play by those. Whereas we've also clearly seen that the UCP, particularly under Danielle Smith, they don't even know what those rules are. And even if they did, it seems very clear that they don't want to play with them.
But they defy the rules. Look, Jason Kenney was investigated by the elections commissioner. He dissolved the commissioner's office right in the middle of being investigated by him, right? So you're right. At least you will have a mechanism by which you can hold the government to account. And the fact is that that Rachel has reverence and respect for democratic institutions. So even if you don't like some of her decisions, there is a way of addressing that issue, and she will play by well-established rules. And if you really worry about economy, you have to ask yourself, what does this ongoing instability do to the investment climate in our province? We are politically the least stable province of all. We used to be the bastion of stability. That is why people voted for 44 years for government. And now I deal in the world of investment. Investors look for two things: return on investment and stability of the climate in which they invest. They often will even take a lower return on investment if they know that the investment is stable. Right now, as an Albertan, I would have a very difficult time advising an investor to invest into any sector in this province, because I don't honestly know what the premier will say during tomorrow's press conference about that particular industry. That from a business perspective, if you're looking for stability, you're getting exactly the opposite. But let's put this again into perspective. This is a government where the premier is now investigated by the ethics commissioner, where Minister of Justice is investigated by the Law Society, where a couple cabinet ministers and several MLAs are investigated by the RCMP for the criminal investigation of the UCP leadership race. This is your government right now. Now, what message are you sending when you're saying that is fine, we will still re-elect you? It's okay to be under criminal investigation, ethical investigation, professional investigation, and we will still re-elect you. Is this who we are? Is this the best that we can do? Do we deserve that kind of a government? Do we want our children to look up to these individuals and say, son, daughter, this is how you conduct yourself. This is what you get rewarded for in life by behaving like this? This is everything that we as parents tell our kids not to do. Why would we elect a group of people like this into government?
I got two other questions that I want to ask you, because you have been extraordinarily generous with your time. But I do want to ask these two things because one of them scares me very much, and the other one I'm just super curious. I got to warn you in advance. Usually I say two more questions and then there's six. So my apologies before that happens. But one of the scenarios that I've been playing with that has me particularly alarmed is when we take a look at a lot of the polling that's coming out for the province. Some people are saying 1 seat, some people are saying 6 seats, but it seems very clear that this is going to be a very close election. And it is battleground Calgary. There's no question about that. The thing that I'm worried about is that we've got this group called Take Back Alberta who's operating in the background. They're pulling a lot of strings. They take credit for having Kenney removed. They take credit for installing Smith. And the thing that scares me is if this is a super close election, let's say it's a difference of, I'm pulling a number out of the ether, 6 seats. If Take Back Alberta has 7 MLAs that they've installed, and they're not far from that, then the nightmare scenario for me, and this is where I'm hoping you're going to tell me I'm wrong, but the nightmare scenario for me is that those 7 MLAs can then go to Danielle Smiths or whoever the next premier is, because let's be serious, she's going to get eaten alive in no time. But they can go and say, hey, that's a real nice government you've got there. Be a shame if something happened to it. Here's the policies that you're going to be putting forward. We've already written the bills. Here's the script. Go ahead. Is that possible? Please tell me I'm wrong.
I'd love to tell you you're wrong, but you're not wrong. And that's the problem when a premier becomes beholden to any particular group. When you make a pact with the devil, you have to live by that pact. And in no uncertain terms, we know that Take Back Alberta was pivotal in Kenney's demise. And Kenney even said himself that the crazies have taken over his party, and that's why he's out. He knew he had no chance to fight them. They would eat him seat by seat by seat by every nomination. So now you have this group that took over basically the board of UCP and now are winning nominations one by one. And since they're doing it mostly in rural Alberta, those MLAs are likely to get elected, those candidates. So they will hold the balance of power. And they will be wielding that power because they have a very clear, what I think most Albertans would consider to be a radical agenda, and they're only getting elected to push that particular agenda. So they will do what they have to draft the legislation and pass the legislation to see their vision come to fruition. And that's where Danielle Smith is extremely vulnerable right now. She brought them to the dance and she has to continue dancing with them. We saw a little bit of that in our PC caucus when Premier Stelmach was in that chair. There was a group of rogue right-wing ministers and MLAs. One happens to be a member of parliament right now from Calgary, and they decided that they will hold Stelmach hostage and say we will vote against the budget and spark a vote of non-confidence if you don't do certain things we want you to do. Stelmach decided to resign. shortly thereafter. But when you have a group of rogue MLAs that think they hold the balance of power, they become very powerful and very dangerous MLAs. And again, they're not answerable to the democratic process. It doesn't matter what the legislature votes; they have the premier, and the premier will do what they want her to do. So that's part of the reason why I'm doing what I'm doing, is because not only has UCP become, it's unfortunate that they even have the word conservative in their name, but has become sort of radicalized version of what used to be conservatism. But now within this radical party, they have a even more so radical subculture of this Take Back Alberta, and a premier who A, made a deal with them, so is beholden to them, and B, doesn't have the capacity to push back.
That's not great. That wasn't the answer that I was hoping for. I was hoping you were going to say, oh no, there's this obscure parliamentary thing that will keep Alberta safe.
And those who oppose, Rachel, they'll say, well, what about unions? She has unions. She has to do what unions do. There is a big difference. And trust me, I had epic battles with unions when I was a Minister of Labor. I was in charge of all of the collective bargaining. Again, it was done differently. There was respect. We would meet, we would talk, we would negotiate. So there was a respectful exchange, and there's a labor code in Alberta that governs relationship between government and labor unions, and there's process of appeals for both. So a union can't come to a premier and say, give us a massive pay raise or double our vacations or give us. No, it still has to go through a process that is formal. Sure, it helps to have a premier that sees eye to eye with you, but premier doesn't have that authority to do that with labor unions. Plus, labor unions are in themselves elected bodies by workers, by Albertans, by Alberta workers that choose their executive, who they are. So the process is much more transparent. You may not like it, but it is governed and it is much more transparent. Take Back Alberta is sort of a dark force. We don't know who they are. We know who the leader is. We have no idea where their money comes from. We hear rumors, but we don't know. Some of them are from British Columbia. Some are criminally charged right now, awaiting trials. And they're pushing an agenda that doesn't have to go through a labor board, that doesn't have to go through any process. They're pushing a social agenda that premier can unilaterally make happen if squeezed. So there is a big difference between what a relationship between a union and a premier can and cannot do versus dark money and movements like Take Back Alberta, to whom the premier is beholden. You don't see unions nominating candidates, showing up in buses, taking over NDP associations to put their union members in those. It just doesn't happen. Because they have respect for the process, and they know that even if they did, as I said earlier, they simply cannot make things happen the way these unstructured, not organized, not governed forces can. This Take Back Alberta doesn't fall under any donation limitations. They're not a political party. They have no auditors. Nobody scrutinizes them. They don't have any of the mechanisms that are in place for any other third-party organization.
Yeah, it's not great. I want to end. I knew it was going to end on I didn't know, but I had a hard feeling that it was going to end on a uh-oh kind of feeling. So I'm going to do a hard pivot on you here. I'm super curious, and this has almost nothing to do with I think it has nothing to do with the provincial election. The halal financing. What is that? Because it's something that you've been talking about on your social media channels quite a bit, and for me, I'm just going to put all my ignorance on display here. I hear halal and I think food.
So yeah, you think meat.
Exactly. So what is, for our audience, and for me as well, What is halal finance? How does it?
Well, I'm actually glad you asked, because there's a lot of misunderstandings, and I've been going through a massive learning curve for the last number of years. Halal actually means religiously permissible. Okay, it's just like kosher for Jews. So it means religiously permissible. And even though we mostly associate it with food, because we see it in restaurants and at Costco on beef and other chicken, that means it's okay to eat it because it's permissible. Now, for me, it's serendipity. I was approached by the Muslim community to see if I can solve their problem. But Roman Catholics, believe it or not, used to be in the same predicament many years ago. And actually, it's that predicament that was part of the reason why anti-Semitism began in Europe. And it was that Catholics then, just like Muslims now, could not go to conventional banks and borrow money and could not lend money with interest, because interest, both in Islam and long time ago in Catholicism, was considered to be usury. I'm not providing you with any service. All I'm doing is taking advantage of the fact that I have money and you don't. So I'm charging you for using my money. And that's considered usury, and it's unethical, and it's taking advantage of a person. Catholics got rid of it because Catholics couldn't open banks. Catholics couldn't do a lot of enterprise, and Jews could. Muslims held on to it. So pious Muslims, which is by far majority, cannot go to a conventional bank and get a mortgage because A, there is interest involved. B, the money that banks lend is commingled often with investments that are not well aligned with Islam. So banks will invest in anything that will give them a profit: cannabis, alcohol, pork plants, you name it. A lot of those things are considered to be sinful to Muslims. So they don't want to deal with money that also yielded from those kinds of investments, and they don't want their mortgage payback as they're paying it back to be invested into those things either. So there are two big barriers. Number three, in Islamic contracts, a contract is considered honorable only when it's between two parties. Banks often use insurance companies or CMHC. There are third parties involved, and in Islam, that is considered to be not a proper form of contract. So I was approached a few years ago to see if there is a way of setting up a system in Canada that would meet all the requirements of Islamic contracts and religious limitations, but also be enforceable in Canadian courts in case something ever went wrong, so they can go to court and sue just like anybody. So I took that upon myself, and I put together a team of lawyers from across Canada and Islamic finance scholars from across the world. And for about 3 years, contracts were flying back and forth. We were trying to hammer out contracts that are both Sharia law compliant, halal, and also enforceable in Canadian courts. And we nailed it down. And then the next thing was, can you now implement it? So again, took time to find investment portfolios that will invest into this. And now my colleague, John Stainton, and I, we own Canadian Halal Financial Corporation, and we give mortgages to Muslims across Alberta, and we're hoping to go across Canada shortly.
How do you make money doing that? Like, how does the return on investment work? Because that's, like, as you were talking, I was like, okay, I think I follow all of it, but how does that translate into, and so it's worth doing?
Yeah. So yeah, it's a business. It's for profit, obviously. So Islam really is very practical when it comes to business. Islam is not saying that you can't make profit. Just don't charge interest. Don't calculate it as interest. And I often compare it to halal meat. You know, you can have on a barbecue a steak that one is halal and one isn't. And if you tried them both, they taste exactly the same because the two cows were in the same pasture, eating grass side by side, except they got killed differently. Yeah. Different process, right? But the steak is the same. Same thing really happens with finance. We simply do different accounting. None of our accounting is interest-based. So what we do is cost plus profit. So Islam allows for us to make a modest profit. So we make a modest profit, and then we're allowed to pass the true cost flow through onto our clients. So we have to pay dividends for investments. We have offices, we have staff. Those costs we can pass on to our clients so they can bear costs. So they pay cost plus profit. And that's how it's calculated. and that's how it is divided. Whereas when you borrow money from a bank, they say 6% interest rate. You don't know what's cost, what's profit. That's the going rate. We don't guide ourselves by that. So some people may say it's semantics, but so is halal meat. All religions are semantics, but that's what's important. That's faith. But the real challenge was putting together those contracts that they meet both Canadian legal and those requirements. And it's really good for Canada because most of these Muslim clients that we have, and we have hundreds of them already, used to be renters. They would pay horrendous rent entire houses, but simply could not go to a bank and had to save cash until they could buy a house cash. And you know what that would be like. Every time you think you have enough money, prices of houses go up. So you never quite save enough. Now they just provide a down payment and they can finance a house just like you and I. So it's good for home builders. It's good for renovation companies. It's good for everybody. And from my perspective, there's a little bit of social justice to it because, there's really no reason why a large segment of Canadian population shouldn't have access to mortgages. Why can't they have homes? If there is a workable solution that can be found. So that's exactly what we do. We are looking at expanding into student loans and other forms of loans, car loans, so that they can fully participate in our Canadian economy. And our clients by far are born in Canada, very well educated. We have medical doctors and others who are our clients, and they simply, because they have faith, they choose not to go to a bank. Now they have an option.
That's cool. Thank you so much for walking me through that, because I've been watching it and super, super curious. And I'm not too ashamed to say that a little bit too timid to ask the question on social media because...
Yeah, and you shouldn't. No, those questions are not taboo. And, there is another issue in Canada. And now I don't have the capacity to address that because we're so overwhelmed with this halal. But, most Canadians don't know that First Nations who live on reserves can't get a mortgage either, because they don't own the land on which they would build a house. So there is no collateral, there is no asset. So many of our First Nations are disadvantaged, even if they wanted to build a house on a reserve and pay it off. They have great jobs and in oil field and everywhere else, they can't get a mortgage. So there's another problem that needs to be addressed. But those are quirky things that most of us don't know about. And I found that really surprising because I represented Castle Downs for 14 years. And the first mosque in Canada, the Al Rashid Mosque, is just next to Castle Downs Riding. And nobody was sort of raising that as an issue. Muslims almost were conditioned to accepting the fact that they will never own a house. Whereas in other Commonwealth countries like New Zealand, UK, Australia, Islamic banks have been formed. And so that's exactly what we're doing right now. It just, no one has done it before in Canada, and I don't know why.
Okay. I got one more question. See, I told you I was going to do it. I'm going to do it.
Go for it.
How many different premiers did you work with?
Let's count them. 5, I think. Ralph Klein, Ed Stelmach, Alison Redford, David Hancock, and then Prentice for a few months. 5.
Would any of those premiers have taken an unmoderated call from Artur Pawlowski? None.
I can tell you that right now, none. Frankly, I cannot think of any premier or cabinet minister that I know. Rick McIver, when he was running for leadership against Prentice and myself, got himself in trouble with Pawlowski. He, in Calgary, participated in an annual March for Jesus that Pawlowski was organizing. And I like to give Rick a benefit of doubt. He probably did not know how crazy Pawlowski was and what this march was all about. Rick is a devout Christian, so he probably thought it was a Christian thing to do. So I think we can let him off the hook. But Danielle knew exactly who Pawlowski is. So she listened to his speeches. This guy was saying, "We will fight the police until we die." He was advocating murder. I'm sorry.
He said, "Let's make it our Alamo."
Let's make it our Alamo, exactly. So no, I can tell you as a premier and as a deputy premier, frankly, you don't just take calls. There is a whole, again, she doesn't understand the protocol. So she probably picks up her cell phone and she dials, and I bet you it's not even a blocked number, so somebody can call her back. As a premier, as a minister, but particularly as a premier and deputy premier, phone calls are scheduled through staff. They're vetted, and you usually get either verbal or written briefing saying, Premier, at 12:05, you have a 5-minute call scheduled with so-and-so. This is who they are, and this is what likely they may ask you, because the bureaucracy will do research. They'll check who the person is and what their issues are. What is it that they will raise? So you can sort of mentally prepare yourself for that phone call. You don't just pick up a phone and call somebody. You would never, ever call somebody who has been criminally charged or is awaiting trial or sentencing. Those are just obvious no-nos. And you don't engage in that long of a conversation either. I have to tell you, the life of a premier is hectic. 5-minute call is a long call. You take a 5-minute call, you do the courtesies, and then you say, good talking to you. I appreciate what you're saying. I will let my deputy minister or my chief of staff take up this issue with you, and I hope that you can resolve it and you remove yourself from it. Premiers and deputy premiers and even cabinet ministers don't have the capacity and the ability to resolve minutia of issues. That's what the bureaucracy is for. That's where the knowledge base is, and you heavily rely on that. This was a very bizarre phone call. But again, that same thing. You play with Take Back Alberta. You're stuck with them. You play with Pawlowski. Now she's stuck with him. She made him promises, and he is going to hold her to it.
That's what I thought your answer was going to be, but I just figured I'd double check. Thomas, it feels weird to call you Thomas. It just does.
Call me Thomas. This honorable thing is funny. It's actually very nice that they allowed us to carry the titles in posterity, because that's what happens in most Commonwealth countries. But use it judiciously. And now I think, as we're watching this circus, pretty soon, I think Albertans will doubt if any politicians are honorable, and that's unfortunate. And that's unfortunate. Somebody actually said on Twitter, we should remove that title honorable. And I said, that's when they win. No, start voting for people who actually are honorable, and you won't have that problem.
Raise the bar, don't lower it.
That's right.
Thank you so much for taking the time to chat today. I'm just so tickled that you agreed to do this and that we had the conversation that we did. So thank you so much again.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. Keep up the great work. I enjoy your podcast.
Oh, thank you. As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here at The Breakdown, we would love it if you swung by our Patreon page at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab and signed up for a small monthly sponsorship of the work that we're trying to do here. It is because of the support that we receive from our Patreon sponsors that we're able to continually up our game, and it is tremendously appreciated. So I want to throw a big thank you out to them, and you can go ahead and visit that website and join and support us as well, because we need all the help we can get. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much for listening and being part of these important conversations. And we will see you next time on The Breakdown.